Picture this. You're going about your normal day when suddenly people around you start dropping like flies. Not from violence, not from accidents, but from something invisible. Something that spreads faster than wildfire and kills more efficiently than any weapon ever created. Welcome to the world of pandemic plagues, where microscopic killers have shaped human history more than any war, revolution, or natural disaster. Most people think they know about plagues. They picture medieval times, maybe some rats, and call it a day. But what if I told you that the deadliest pandemic in human history wasn't the Black Death? What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, there are diseases lurking in melting permafrost, in laboratory freezers, and in remote corners of the world that make COVID-19 look like a mild cold? I'm about to take you on a journey through humanity's darkest biological nightmares. We're going to explore pandemics so devastating they literally changed the course of civilization. Plagues that wiped entire empires off the map, and diseases that killed more people in a single year than died in all of World War II. But here's the thing that'll keep you watching until the very end. Some of these killers are still out there, and a few might be making a comeback. By the time we're done, you'll understand why epidemiologists lose sleep at night, why certain government facilities are more secure than nuclear weapon sites, and why the next pandemic might not come from where you think. I've spent months researching the most terrifying biological events in human history, consulting with virologists, epidemiologists, and historians to bring you the complete picture of how diseases have repeatedly brought humanity to its knees. Let me start with something that'll blow your mind. The deadliest single pandemic in recorded history wasn't actually a plague at all. It was the 1918 flu pandemic, and it killed more people in 2 years than the bubonic plague killed in 4 centuries. We're talking about 50 to 100 million deaths when the global population was only 1.8 billion people. That's like if today, between 200 and 400 million people just vanished. But what made the 1918 flu so uniquely terrifying wasn't just its kill count. This virus had a twisted sense of humor. Instead of targeting the usual suspects like the elderly and infirm, it went after healthy young adults in their prime. Picture walking into a hospital and seeing 25-year-old athletes dying faster than 80-year-olds with chronic conditions. That's exactly what happened. The virus triggered something called a cytokine storm, where your own immune system becomes so aggressive in fighting the infection that it literally destroys your lungs from the inside. The stronger your immune system, the more likely you were to die. It's like having a bodyguard who's so overzealous about protecting you that he burns down your house with you inside. Cities turned into ghost towns virtually overnight. In Philadelphia, so many people died so quickly that bodies were stacked like cordwood in the streets because there weren't enough coffins or people alive to bury the dead. Mass graves became the norm. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days, leaving children orphaned and communities devastated. But here's where it gets really disturbing. We still don't fully understand why the 1918 flu was so deadly. Scientists have reconstructed the virus from frozen tissue samples, but the exact mechanism that made it so lethal remains partially mysterious. And that should terrify you. Because if we don't understand what made it so deadly, how can we prevent the next one? Speaking of mysteries, let's talk about the plague that literally ended the ancient world as people knew it. The plague of Justinian hit the Byzantine Empire in 541 AD and kept returning in waves for the next 2 centuries. This wasn't just another disease outbreak. This was civilization getting a factory reset. Imagine Constantinople, one of the greatest cities in the world, with trade routes connecting 3 continents and a population of 500,000 people. Then picture that same city with bodies rotting in the streets, trade completely stopped, and the population cut by 40% in just 4 months. The plague killed an estimated 25 million people across the Byzantine Empire and completely reshaped European history. What makes this plague particularly fascinating is that it was caused by the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death, Yersinia pestis. But the Justinian plague was like the Black Death's psychotic older brother. It spread faster, killed more efficiently, and had a longer lasting impact on civilization. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the concept of empire itself. Justinian had been on the verge of reuniting the Eastern and Western Roman empires, potentially creating a superpower that could have dominated Europe for another 1,000 years. Instead, the plague left his armies decimated, his treasury empty, and his dreams of conquest in ruins. The Dark Ages weren't just caused by barbarian invasions, they were caused by a microscopic killer that reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of Europe. But if you think ancient plagues were bad, wait until you hear about what happened when Europeans brought their diseases to the New World. This wasn't just biological warfare. It was biological genocide on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. When Columbus and subsequent European explorers arrived in the Americas, they brought with them a cocktail of diseases that the indigenous populations had never encountered. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and bubonic plague. The Native Americans had no immunity to these diseases because they had been geographically isolated for thousands of years. What happened next was the largest population collapse in human history. Conservative estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease within a century of European contact. We're talking about the deaths of 50 to 60 million people. To put that in perspective, that's like the entire population of South Korea just disappearing. Entire civilizations vanished almost overnight. The Aztec Empire, which had resisted Spanish conquest for months, collapsed within weeks once smallpox hit Tenochtitlan. Cortés didn't conquer the Aztecs with superior weapons or tactics. He conquered them with invisible biological agents that killed more efficiently than any army ever could. The same pattern repeated across North and South America. Tribes that had existed for thousands of years were wiped out so quickly that we don't even know their names today. Languages, cultures, and entire ways of life disappeared forever because of microscopic killers that traveled in the lungs and on the skin of European explorers. But here's the part that'll really mess with your head. This biological catastrophe wasn't intentional, at least not initially. The Europeans didn't even understand how diseases spread, let alone deliberately weaponize them. They were just as confused as everyone else about why indigenous populations were dying en masse. The greatest act of biological warfare in human history happened by complete accident. However, once some Europeans realized what was happening, they began to use disease as a weapon deliberately. There are documented cases of British officers distributing smallpox-infected blankets to Native American tribes during Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. Biological warfare went from accidental to intentional once people understood the devastating power of pandemic diseases. Now, you might be thinking that modern medicine has made pandemics a thing of the past. After all, we have antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced medical technology that our ancestors could never have dreamed of. But if that's what you're thinking, you're about to get a very rude awakening. The truth is, we're living in what many experts call the pandemic age, and the next great plague might be closer than you think. So, the reason we're more vulnerable to pandemics today than ever before isn't because our medicine has gotten worse. It's because our world has gotten smaller. Every day, millions of people crisscross the globe on airplanes, carrying whatever microscopic hitchhikers they might have picked up along the way. A virus can literally have breakfast in Bangkok, lunch in London, and dinner in New York. What used to take months or years to spread across continents now happens in a matter of hours. But it gets worse. We've created the perfect breeding ground for superbugs through our overuse of antibiotics. Every time you take antibiotics for a viral infection or don't finish your prescribed course, you're essentially training bacteria to become stronger. We're in an evolutionary arms race with microorganisms, and they're winning. Take tuberculosis, for example. You probably think TB is some Victorian-era disease that we conquered decades ago. Wrong. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is making a comeback, and it's nastier than anything Dickens could have imagined. There are strains of TB circulating right now that are resistant to every single antibiotic we have. When doctors encounter these cases, they literally have no weapons left to fight with. And then there's the nightmare scenario that keeps infectious disease experts awake at night. What happens when we dig up something that's been sleeping in the permafrost for thousands of years? Climate change isn't just melting ice caps and raising sea levels. It's thawing out ancient biological time bombs that have been locked away in frozen ground for millennia. Scientists have already revived bacteria that are over 30,000 years old from Siberian permafrost. These organisms are from a time before humans developed any immunity to them, before our ancestors even knew they existed. Imagine a plague that wiped out woolly mammoths suddenly finding its way into our modern, interconnected world. We'd have no natural resistance, no vaccines, no treatment protocols. It would be like the European colonization of the Americas all over again, except this time we'd be the indigenous population with no immunity. But frozen diseases aren't the only thing we need to worry about. There's something far more terrifying brewing in laboratories around the world, and it's happening completely on purpose. Scientists are conducting what they call gain-of-function research, where they deliberately make viruses more deadly or more transmissible to study how they work. The idea is that by understanding how viruses become more dangerous, we can better prepare for natural outbreaks. But here's the problem. When you're dealing with pathogens that could kill millions of people, the line between research and playing with fire becomes dangerously thin. The COVID-19 pandemic may have started this way. While the exact origin is still debated, Many experts believe the virus could have escaped from a laboratory where scientists were studying bat coronaviruses. If that's true, it means the pandemic that shut down the entire world and killed millions of people might have been caused by researchers trying to prevent pandemics. Think about the irony there for a moment. Our attempts to protect ourselves from biological threats might be creating the very threats we're trying to prevent. It's like hiring a bodyguard who accidentally shoots you while cleaning his gun. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of modern pandemic threats: biological weapons. While most countries have signed treaties banning biological warfare, the technology to create devastating biological agents has never been more accessible. You don't need a massive military budget or sophisticated infrastructure anymore. A graduate student with access to basic laboratory equipment could potentially create a biological weapon that makes nuclear bombs look like firecrackers. The barriers to entry have collapsed, while the potential for destruction has skyrocketed. State actors aren't the only concern either. Terrorist organizations and even lone wolf actors could potentially weaponize diseases. Imagine if someone with basic microbiology knowledge decided to enhance the transmissibility of a deadly virus and release it in a major transportation hub. The results would make 9/11 look like a minor incident, but perhaps the most terrifying scenario of all is one that combines multiple threat vectors into what experts call a perfect storm pandemic. Picture this: a naturally occurring virus that's already deadly gets accidentally enhanced in a research laboratory, then escapes during a time when global political tensions are high and international cooperation is breaking down. The virus spreads rapidly through our hyper-connected world, while countries are too busy pointing fingers at each other to mount an effective response. Meanwhile, climate change has already stressed healthcare systems, dealing with heat waves, floods, and other disasters. Social media spreads conspiracy theories faster than health officials can spread accurate information, leading to vaccine hesitancy and resistance to public health measures. This isn't science fiction. Every element of this scenario exists right now, today. We're essentially playing Russian roulette with civilization itself, and we've been pulling the trigger over and over again, getting lucky each time the chamber has been empty. The COVID-19 pandemic was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for something much worse. Despite causing global chaos and killing millions, COVID-19 was actually a relatively mild pandemic by historical standards. It had a low fatality rate compared to diseases like SARS or MERS, and it primarily affected older adults rather than people in their productive years. But what if the next pandemic combines the transmissibility of COVID-19 with the lethality of Ebola? What if it targets children instead of the elderly? What if it spreads before symptoms appear, making containment virtually impossible? These aren't hypothetical questions. Viruses with these exact characteristics already exist in nature. We've just been fortunate that they haven't figured out how to combine all their deadliest traits into one super pathogen. Yet, the scariest part? We're not prepared for any of this. Despite all our technological advances and medical breakthroughs, our global pandemic preparedness is embarrassingly inadequate. The World Health Organization estimates that it would take at least 300 days to develop and distribute a vaccine for a novel pandemic pathogen. That's assuming everything goes perfectly, which it never does. 300 days. Do you know what a truly deadly pandemic can accomplish in 300 days? It can circle the globe dozens of times, mutate into multiple variants, and potentially kill hundreds of millions of people. By the time we have a vaccine ready, there might not be enough people left to vaccinate. Our healthcare systems are already stretched to the breaking point during normal times. Most hospitals operate at near capacity even without a crisis, which means they have almost no surge capacity for handling mass casualties. During COVID-19, we saw hospitals literally running out of basic supplies like masks and ventilators. Now imagine a pandemic that's 10 times deadlier and twice as contagious, hitting those same overwhelmed systems. The supply chains that keep our modern world functioning are incredibly fragile. Just-in-time manufacturing means there are no stockpiles of critical medications, medical equipment, or even basic necessities like food. When panic buying stripped grocery store shelves bare during the early days of COVID-19, that was just a preview of what happens when people lose confidence in the system's ability to provide for them. But the real weak link in our pandemic defenses isn't medical or logistical. It's psychological and social. Humans are fundamentally bad at dealing with invisible, statistical threats. We can see a hurricane coming and board up our windows, but we can't see a virus spreading, and our brains aren't wired to take appropriate precautions against something we can't perceive directly. This cognitive blind spot gets exploited by misinformation campaigns that spread faster than any biological pathogen ever could. During COVID-19, false information about treatments, vaccines, and even the existence of the virus itself spread through social media networks like wildfire. People died because they believed conspiracy theories instead of medical experts. Now imagine that same information chaos during a pandemic that's actually apocalyptic in scope. When people are dying in massive numbers and healthcare systems are completely overwhelmed, the social fabric starts to break down. Trust in institutions evaporates. Neighbors turn against each other. Countries close their borders and hoard resources instead of cooperating globally. This brings us to what might be the most disturbing aspect of pandemic threats. They don't just kill people directly, they destroy the social cooperation that modern civilization depends on. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, it didn't just kill a third of the population. It triggered pogroms against Jewish communities who were scapegoated for the disease. It caused massive economic upheaval that lasted for generations. It fundamentally changed how people viewed religion, authority, and their place in the world. The same pattern has repeated throughout history. Pandemics don't just cause biological damage, they cause social, economic, and political damage that can last for centuries. The fall of entire civilizations can often be traced back to pandemic diseases that weaken them beyond recovery. And here's something that'll really mess with your sleep schedule. We have evidence that some historical pandemics were far worse than anything in recorded history. Ice core samples and genetic analysis suggest that around 70,000 years ago, the entire human population was reduced to maybe 10,000 breeding pairs. We came within a whisker of extinction, possibly due to a supervolcanic eruption that created conditions perfect for pandemic diseases to spread. That genetic bottleneck is why all humans are so remarkably similar at the DNA level compared to other species. We're all descendants of that tiny population that somehow managed to survive whatever biological catastrophe nearly wiped us out. It's a stark reminder that Homo sapiens, for all our technology and intelligence, are still just another species that can be driven to extinction by microscopic organisms. But let's get back to the present day, because there are specific threats brewing right now that deserve your attention. One of the most concerning is the ongoing evolution of influenza viruses in factory farms around the world. Industrial agriculture creates perfect conditions for generating pandemic influenza strains. When you pack thousands of animals into confined spaces with poor air circulation, you're essentially running a biological weapons development program. Viruses can jump between species, swap genetic material, and evolve new capabilities in these concentrated animal feeding operations. H5N1 bird flu is already circulating in poultry farms worldwide, and it has a case fatality rate of about 60% in humans. The only reason it hasn't caused a pandemic yet is that it doesn't transmit efficiently between humans. But every time it infects a person or a pig, there's a chance it could acquire the mutations needed to spread person to person while maintaining its lethality. We're essentially rolling dice with apocalyptic stakes every single day. And eventually, we're going to roll snake eyes. The question isn't whether a pandemic influenza strain will emerge from industrial agriculture, it's when. Then there's the emerging threat of fungal pathogens. Most people think of fungi as relatively harmless organisms that decompose dead matter or occasionally cause athlete's foot. But climate change is forcing fungal pathogens to adapt to higher temperatures, and some of them are becoming capable of infecting warm-blooded animals, including humans. Candida auris is a fungal pathogen that was virtually unknown until a few years ago. Now it's spreading through hospitals worldwide, and it's resistant to most antifungal medications. It has a mortality rate of up to 60% in hospitalized patients, and it can survive on surfaces for weeks or months. The terrifying thing about fungal pandemics is that we have very few weapons to fight them. While we have dozens of antibiotics to fight bacterial infections and numerous antiviral drugs, our antifungal arsenal is extremely limited. If a highly transmissible fungal pathogen emerged tomorrow, we'd be almost defenseless against it. But perhaps the most immediate pandemic threat comes from an unexpected source: our own success in treating bacterial infections. The overuse and misuse of antibiotics has created an evolutionary pressure cooker that's producing superbugs at an alarming rate. Carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, or CRE, is already spreading through healthcare facilities worldwide. These bacteria are resistant to carbapenems, which are considered antibiotics of last resort. When patients get infected with CRE, doctors literally have no proven treatments left to offer. The mortality rate can exceed 50%. But CRE is just the beginning. Scientists that are resistant to every have identified bacteria single antibiotic we have. These so-called pan-drug-resistant organisms represent a return to the pre-antibiotic era, when a simple cut or surgical procedure could easily lead to death from infection. We're entering what some experts call the post-antibiotic age, where routine medical procedures become life-threatening gambles. Hip replacements, chemotherapy, organ transplants, even childbirth could become impossibly dangerous if we can't control bacterial infections. The economic impact alone would be staggering. The World Bank estimates that antimicrobial resistance could reduce global GDP by 3.8% by 2050, pushing 28 million people into extreme poverty. But the human cost would be even worse. Some models suggest that drug-resistant infections could kill 300 million people over the next 30 years if current trends continue. And we're not just running out of antibiotics, we're running out of time to develop new ones. It takes 10 to 15 years and billions of dollars to bring a new antibiotic to market, but bacteria can develop resistance to it within months or years. The economics don't work out for pharmaceutical companies, so investment in antibiotic research has plummeted just when we need it most. This creates a perfect storm scenario where our ability to fight infections is declining just as new pandemic threats are emerging. We could find ourselves facing a viral pandemic while simultaneously dealing with untreatable bacterial co-infections, creating a 1-2 punch that our healthcare systems couldn't possibly handle. But wait, it gets worse. Climate change isn't just thawing out ancient pathogens from permafrost, it's also expanding the geographic range of vector-borne diseases. Mosquitoes, ticks, and other disease-carrying insects are moving into new territories as temperatures rise and weather patterns shift. Diseases that were once confined to tropical regions are now appearing in temperate zones. West Nile virus, dengue fever, chikungunya, and Zika virus are all expanding their reach as their insect vectors adapt to new environments. We could see mosquito-borne pandemics hit in regions that have never dealt with these diseases before and have no infrastructure to handle them. The psychological impact of vector-borne pandemics is particularly insidious because people can't avoid the threat by staying home or wearing masks. When the disease vector is literally in the air around you, nowhere feels safe. This kind of persistent, inescapable threat can drive entire populations to the brink of psychological collapse. And then there are the synthetic biology threats that most people don't even know exist. The same technologies that promise to revolutionize medicine and agriculture could also be used to create biological weapons that make natural pathogens look tame by comparison. Scientists have already demonstrated the ability to synthesize viruses from scratch using nothing but genetic sequence data and laboratory equipment. In 2016, researchers at the University of Alberta synthesized horsepox virus, a relative of smallpox, in just 6 months using materials that cost about $100,000. Now imagine what a well-funded state actor or terrorist organization could accomplish with access to advanced synthetic biology tools. They could potentially create pathogens that are more deadly than anything found in nature, more transmissible than seasonal flu, and specifically designed to evade existing vaccines and treatments. The barriers to this kind of biological terrorism are eroding rapidly as the technology becomes more accessible and the knowledge needed to use it spreads through academic publications and online resources. We're approaching a point where creating a biological weapon could be easier than building a nuclear bomb, and potentially far more devastating. What's truly terrifying is that we might not even know we're under attack until it's too late. A bioweapon designed to spread slowly and remain dormant for weeks or months could infect millions of people before anyone realizes something is wrong. By the time symptoms appear, the pathogen could already be distributed globally through normal travel patterns. This brings us to the ultimate nightmare scenario: a deliberately engineered pandemic that combines multiple deadly characteristics into one super pathogen. Imagine a virus with the transmissibility of measles, the lethality of Ebola, the latency period of HIV, and the ability to reinfect people multiple times. Such a pathogen could theoretically wipe out most of human civilization while remaining completely invisible until it's far too late to stop. The people who created it might not even survive their own weapon, making it the ultimate doomsday device with no off switch. But even if we never face an intentionally created biological weapon, the natural evolution of pathogens in our modern world presents threats that are almost as terrifying. The combination of global travel, urbanization, industrial agriculture, antibiotic resistance, and climate change has created conditions that are perfect for generating and spreading pandemic diseases. We're living through what might be the most dangerous period in human history from a biological perspective. Our ancestors faced individual pandemics, but we're facing the possibility of multiple simultaneous pandemic threats converging into a perfect storm of biological catastrophe. The question isn't whether another devastating pandemic will hit us. It's whether our civilization can survive when it does. And based on how we handled COVID-19, which was relatively mild by historical standards, the answer should terrify you. But there's one more aspect of pandemic threats that I haven't mentioned yet, and it might be the most disturbing of all. It's not just about the diseases themselves. It's about what happens to human society when people realize that their governments, their medical systems, and their entire way of life can't protect them from invisible killers. When that realization hits on a global scale, civilization itself becomes the casualty. The breakdown doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small cracks in the foundation of trust that holds society together. First, people stop believing official casualty numbers because they've seen too many bodies that don't match the statistics. Then, they stop trusting medical advice because they've watched recommended treatments fail their loved ones. Finally, they stop believing that anyone in charge actually knows what they're doing. This erosion of faith creates a feedback loop that makes every aspect of a pandemic worse. When people don't trust authorities, they don't follow public health guidelines. When they don't follow guidelines, the disease spreads faster. When the disease spreads faster, authorities lose even more credibility. It's a death spiral that can turn a manageable outbreak into civilizational collapse. We've seen glimpses of this during smaller crises. During Hurricane Katrina, social order broke down in New Orleans within days. People were shooting at rescue helicopters and looting hospitals while patients died in their beds. That was just one city dealing with a localized natural disaster. Now imagine that same breakdown happening simultaneously across every major population center on Earth. But here's what really keeps pandemic experts awake at night. We're not just vulnerable to one catastrophic outbreak. We're vulnerable to cascade failures where multiple biological threats hit us at the same time, overwhelming our ability to respond to any of them effectively. Picture this scenario. A novel influenza strain emerges from industrial agriculture and begins spreading person to person with a high fatality rate. While health systems are overwhelmed dealing with flu patients, hospital-acquired infections with drug-resistant bacteria spike because infection control protocols break down. Meanwhile, climate change pushes dengue-carrying mosquitoes into new territories, creating vector-borne outbreaks in regions with no experience handling them. Each crisis would be manageable on its own, but together they create a perfect storm that exceeds every response capacity we have. Hospitals can't handle the patient load, supply chains collapse under the strain, and healthcare workers start abandoning their posts when they realize the situation is hopeless. This isn't theoretical speculation. Mathematical models suggest that the probability of multiple pandemic threats converging is increasing exponentially as global risk factors multiply. We're not just rolling one die anymore, we're rolling dozens of them simultaneously, and any combination of bad outcomes could spell disaster. The psychological warfare aspect of modern pandemics makes everything worse. During COVID-19, we saw how quickly misinformation could spread through social networks, convincing people that effective treatments were dangerous while promoting useless or harmful alternatives. Now imagine that same information chaos during a pandemic that's actually killing people at rates that make COVID-19 look trivial. When people are dying in massive numbers and traditional authority figures have lost credibility, conspiracy theories fill the vacuum. These aren't harmless delusions anymore. They become survival strategies for people who don't know who to trust. If you can't trust doctors, scientists, or government officials, maybe the random person on social media claiming they have the real cure starts to sound reasonable. This creates a situation where accurate information becomes indistinguishable from misinformation in the minds of panicked populations. People make life and death decisions based on whatever narrative feels most emotionally satisfying rather than what's actually true. The result is that effective countermeasures get abandoned while harmful practices spread like wildfire. But the information warfare goes beyond just confusion and conspiracy theories. In a truly catastrophic pandemic, different groups would likely develop completely incompatible narratives about what's happening and what should be done about it. These competing worldviews could turn neighbors into enemies and make coordinated responses impossible. Think about how divided societies became during COVID-19 over relatively minor public health measures like mask mandates. Now imagine that same polarization when the stakes are existential and the measures required are far more extreme. Quarantine enforcement, resource rationing, medical triage decisions, all of these become flashpoints for violence when people believe their survival depends on resisting authority. The economic dimension of pandemic collapse is equally terrifying. Modern economies are incredibly complex systems that depend on millions of interconnected relationships functioning smoothly. When a significant percentage of the workforce becomes ill or dies, these relationships start breaking down in unpredictable ways. So there you have it. From the 1918 flu that turned our own immune systems against us, to the plague of Justinian that reset civilization itself, to the biological time bombs thawing in permafrost right now. Pandemics aren't just medical events. They're civilization-ending catastrophes that have shaped human history more than wars, natural disasters, or any other force. And the scariest part, we're more vulnerable today than we've ever been. Every flight that takes off, every antibiotic prescribed, every laboratory experiment brings us closer to the next great plague. The question isn't if it'll happen, it's whether we'll survive when it does. Sleep tight.